Welcome. Thanks for being here. I went to my own shelf to write this, and the 2000s weren't on it. 10 years. I had a job, I had a house, and I had considerably more opinions than either could support. I own 7 bottles from this decade, and I counted twice, and then I counted a third time with the lamp on. And as you can see, all 7 are on my tray. And we're going to go through every one of them at the end of this properly, one at a time. What they smell like, how long they last, whether any of them is still the thing it was. This is the last quarter of the episode, and everything before this is how these bottles got there and why the other 99% of that decade smelled the way it did. Every one of the 7 bottles is something the decade was arguing against, and they come from 2 houses, 4 Hermès and 3 Chanels, which is either taste or a rut, and I've had 20 years to decide and haven't. Not one fruity thing, no celebrity thing, nothing I had decided that a 15-year-old would ever have asked for. And for about an hour, I felt marvelous about this. I thought, well, there you are. Taste. You were a serious young woman with a serious nose, and while everybody else queued for the pink one, there you were, quietly buying the good one. And then I looked at what I'd spent, and at what everyone else had actually spent, and the feeling packed up and left. So the 2000s weren't a decade of bad taste. They were a decade of borrowed money. The bottles I skipped weren't worse than mine. They were louder, and they were louder for a reason. And the reason is the most interesting thing about those 10 years, because everything then was bought on terms. Fame came borrowed off a record label. Status off a credit line. And shelf space off next year's launch. And a perfume, which is the one possession other people are obliged to receive whether or not they fancied it, turned out to be the cleanest way going of announcing something you hadn't yet paid for. And perfume is a peculiar object to put on your neck at 8 in the morning. You are not wearing it. You're handing it to strangers who never agreed to take it. I didn't have taste. I had a smaller overdraft. But before any of that, there is something I need to put on. So my left wrist is Chance. Let's put a good 3 or 4 sprays on. And my right wrist is Coco Mademoiselle. Both Chanel, both Jacques Polge, 1 year apart. Neither of them is off my own shelf, and both the decants bought in this from bottles old enough to be the thing I'm actually talking about. My own Chance is on the tray behind me, and it's no use to me here because it's been quietly brought up to date, the way nearly everything in this episode has, and you can't test a decade with a bottle from this year. So, with a caveat, I would rather say myself than have said to me, a 20-year-old decant has spent 20 years in somebody's drawer, so what's on my arm is 2002, the way a photocopy is a photograph. Close, but not the thing. I'm not touching either of them again until the end, and the whole argument you're about to sit through is whether there's any real distance between these 2 wrists, and I've been quietly assuming that there is for 20 years. So the 2000s were sweet and loud. Flowerbomb by Olivier Polge, Carlos Benaim, Domity Michelin-Bantier, and Dominique Ropion, 2005. The notes are tea, bergamot, jasmine sambac, orange tree, cattleya, orchid, freesia, rose, amber, patchouli, musk, and it opens as sugar. Not fruit, not a flower, just sugar. for about 2 minutes. And then it becomes an enormous soft cloud with no corners anywhere. And it stays there for 3 hours in every direction. It's on your coat the following week, and it's sold in a bottle, as you can see, shaped like a hand grenade, which apparently went through the entire process unqueried. The patchouli in it, meanwhile, is doing nothing earthy whatsoever. It has had the same treatment as Coco Mademoiselle's 4 years later, with considerably more sugar over the top. Angel, Olivia Cresp, and Yves Deshuy for Mugler, 1992. This was a frightening perfume. Dirty patchouli, unrepentant sugar, made by people who weren't worried about your comfort. The 2000s took Angel's architecture, removed everything alarming in it, and turned the volume up to cover the gap. And that's the decade in one gesture. And the gesture isn't cynical so much as commercially obvious. The 90s avant-garde with the danger taken out, the amplifier left on, and a marketing department that couldn't believe how well it worked. And then Alien, which is the exception that shows you what the rule was. Dominique Ropion and Laurent Briere, 2005. Alien is nearly a 3-material perfume, and that's why it divides people so violently. Because they're not loud from a want of restraint. It's not that nobody forgot to stop. Loud was the specification. And if you've ever wondered what a brief for a perfume actually looks like, it looks like this. Be identifiable across a room by a stranger in under 2 seconds. Now, that is, you're right, not a brief for a perfume. That's a brief for a logo. And there was a fault sitting inside that specification from the very first morning. Because a perfume built to be identified across a room gets bought by everybody who wants that, which by 2005 was everybody. And then the trouble starts, and it starts in 2 places that never meet. The woman wearing it stops being able to smell it. Now, that's not her being ungrateful, and it's not a bad bottle. It's her olfactory system doing the job it's actually for, which is not to tell you what is in the room, but to tell you what has changed in it. An unchanging smell stops being news, so she sprays a little more, and a bit more after that, and then her daughter says something. And meanwhile, everyone else stops hearing it as a decision at all. It becomes the smell of a lift or of a bus on a Tuesday morning, which is why nobody I know can tell me what they wore in 2005, and every single one of them can tell me what 2005 smelled like. Those 2 sentences shouldn't both be true. In this decade, they are, because the perfumes had stopped belonging to the woman wearing them and started belonging to the buildings. So the decade made perfume as loud as it has ever been, and in exactly the same years, in exactly the same shops, that decade produced the blankest, most deliberately absent perfume ever sold at scale, and sold a great deal of it. Clean, 2003. No perfume accredited then or since. The notes, well, you know, the house has never published a pyramid for the notes. And there are 2 lists in circulation that actually contradict each other. What everybody agrees on is galaxolide class laundry musk at volume, brightened with aldehydes over cotton and fabric softener. I mean, this is a fragrance house whose whole proposition is that you're not wearing any fragrance. So the product is the smell of having just washed off the previous product. Clean wasn't a curiosity. Clean was the shape of the entire mass market. Galaxolide and its relatives, which is the musk that is literally in your washing powder. It's in Bath and Body Works. It's in Victoria's Secret. Every body spray on every teenager in the country. And at the top of that tier in 2007 was Mach Jacob's Daisy, Alberto Marias. Now, put the Shout, the loud perfumes, and the Null, the clean, side by side, because they look like opposites, but they are the same animal. Everything else it signaled with was optional at the far end. I mean, you can look away from a monogram, you can leave the magazine on a shelf, you can decline the entire kitchen of the island, but you cannot decline a smell. There's no consent in it. Somebody gets into the lift and their decisions are now happening to your face for 4 floors. So the decade did the only 2 things there were to do, and it did both at once, which is why it looks incoherent from here. Maximize the one channel nobody can refuse, or empty it out and pretend nothing was said. And the liquid didn't move an inch. Whatever the advertising, it started saying, what was in those bottles went on being engineered for a stranger at 10 feet for 6 hours, whether or not the stranger had asked to be included. A diary, then, bolted onto an object with no indoor setting. And so that gap is the most dishonest thing about the decade, and it is the only part of it you can smell. But you know, the same instruction was arriving on television with the manners removed. Extreme Makeover in 2002, The Swan 2004, and the American Society of Plastic Surgeons states in its own official history that its members carried out more than 8.7 million cosmetic procedures in 2003, up 32% in a single year, and it attributes that to television saturation. So the logic of a makeover show is that your problem is legibility. You are not being read correctly, and the correction is surgical. Now, that is also the logic of every perfume in this episode, and I don't think anybody involved meant it that way. So, let's go to the shopping centre. Fierce, over here, Christophe Laudemille and Bruno Jovanovic 2002. It's a cologne, and the notes are marine notes, lemon, orange, petitgrain, cardamom, fir, clary sage, rosemary, lily of the valley, rose, jasmine, vetiver, oak moss, Brazilian rosewood, sandalwood musk. And in 2002, Abercrombie and Fitch launched a cologne called Fierce, and it is good. And that makes it very inconvenient for everything I'm about to say, and it doesn't stop it being true. This is a fougere skeleton, fur and petitgrain and rosemary barbershop DNA in a 90s marine coat. And somebody competent made this. Now the numbers. By 2009, Fierce had sold $190 million worth, a figure Abercrombie put in a court filing of its own, and the same filing says that the company spent more than $3 million across 2 years on machines to spray it through the shops. $3 million on machines. Somebody costed that. Somebody signed it off. So Fierce was never a cologne. Fierce was the bouncer. It told you before you had touched a price tag or found out whether they made your size exactly which bodies the shop was for. And that's what a scent branding budget actually buys. And it's not desire. It's sorting. And then 2008 hands us the same trick for men with the promise said out loud and no shop required. 1 million. Christophe Renaud, Olivier Pachou, and Michel Girard, 2008. Eau de toilette. Notes here: grapefruit, mint, blood orange, rose, cinnamon, spice notes, blonde leather, white woods, amber, patchouli. There are 3 perfumers again on one brief, which tells you it was engineered rather than composed. You can see the bottle is a gold ingot and the name is an amount of money, and at no stage did anybody lose their nose, and I'm fairly sure nobody thought any was required. Look, the juice opens well, right? So grapefruit, blood mandarin, mint, and for about 8 minutes it smells very expensive. And then the cinnamon arrives, and underneath it there is sugar, cotton candy, which is ethyl maltol or one of its cousins, and which Angel made famous on Woman 16 years earlier. And that it is candy floss poured over hot sanded wood for 11 hours, whether or not you leave the room. This is the most consequential thing that happens to men's perfume this century, because sweetness crosses the line and never crosses back, and every blue and sugar masculine on the shelf today descends from this bottle, whether or not the people making them could name it. And 1 million works. It gets compliments. It gets more unsolicited compliments from ordinary people than nearly anything else made that decade. And its fans have a coherent argument, which is that a perfume exists to happen to other people. And this one demonstrably does. So the contempt has nothing to do with what is in the bottle. Nobody in that argument, not one person, is discussing a molecule. But they are discussing a 19-year-old in a nightclub. And they all decided some time ago that he was embarrassing, and the bottle is the only place they're allowed to say so. Now, here is the thing I found, and I couldn't put it down. Fierce and 1 Million are the two best-selling men's perfumes of that decade, and between them, they're what men smelled like for 10 years in 2 countries, at every price point that mattered, and nobody ever wrote about either of them. Not seriously, not once, not anywhere I could find, and I looked properly. What exists is journalism about the Abercrombie Corporation and shopping content about 1 Million, but no perfume criticism at all. Nobody wrote them. And I've gone back twice since, in case the second search turned up what the first one missed. Now, perfume criticism had no vocabulary for any of that, so to some extent it looked away. And then the silence became evidence. If nobody serious ever wrote about it, it can't have been serious, which is a very tidy way of turning nobody having bothered into a verdict. So why was everything so loud, and why did the loudest things cost so little? 2 numbers. Between 2002 and the end of 2007, American household debt grew at about 13% a year. Income grew at about 5%. And a perfume that fills a room is that gap made audible. A claim on a position you don't occupy yet, broadcast to people who can't decline it for $70. The industry has a comforting story about this, and the story is wrong twice. There is proper experimental work on the effect, and it says something else entirely. And when researchers tested it, what recession cues switched on wasn't comfort, it was competition. And it showed up for beauty products and didn't extend to other small treats. So the trade spent 10 years telling itself it was selling consolation, and the evidence says it was selling ammunition. Now, the same arithmetic on the other side of the counter, where it runs the opposite way. At the start of the decade, Coty was a $1.4 billion company. By 2009, its chief executive was calling it $4 billion, double-digit growth, every year until the crash, which sounds like a company that got very good at making perfume. And it isn't. It got very good at buying the right to use other people's names. And in 2005, it bought Unilever's cosmetics business for $800 million and said the thing would add $600 million a year. All right, so read that back slowly. $800 million once for $600 million a year forever. 1.3 times sales in any other industry. somebody would ring up about the decimal point. So why so cheap? Well, because Coty wasn't buying anything, it was buying permission. Contracts to put somebody else's name on a bottle for an agreed number of years, after which the name goes home. So a tenancy then, a spectacularly expensive one, and one you can be evicted from by a photographer. And 5 years later, when Coty went shopping for brands it could actually own, it was reportedly paying around $1 billion each. Same company, same decade, roughly 7 times the multiple, because this time the thing didn't expire. And so the celebrity fragrance, which everyone in my line of work has been rude about for 20 years, is that arithmetic in its purest form. You weren't buying a name. You were buying attention somebody else had paid for. Glow by J.Lo went to #1 in America. Coty's own chief executive put the company's share of the whole celebrity category at around 8%. And then it stopped. And how it stopped is the best number in the episode. It comes from a different company entirely, so let me introduce it properly. Parlux is not a part of Coty. It never was. It's a separate business in Florida. It was publicly listed in its own right, and its entire trade was holding celebrity fragrance licenses, Paris Hilton's chief among them. Paris Hilton was 68% of Parlux's sales in the 2008 financial year, 55 in 2009, 42 in 2010, 68, 55, 42. And Parlux's total sales barely moved. Somewhere around 150 million all 3 years. So nothing failed. The customer didn't leave. The shops didn't close. Parlux had signed Jessica Simpson in 2007 and had been holding the guest license since 2003, and it kept working the roster the way you would work a fleet, which is what it was. Which means the story we all tell ourselves, the one where the public finally got sick of celebrity perfume, is wrong. You know, the public was perfectly happy. The public had no idea any of this was happening. And what happened is that a celebrity is a depreciating asset. Parlux was running a fleet, and when one of them stopped being photographed, they swapped it out. No culture turned against anything. A balance sheet did what a balance sheet do on schedule in an office, and the result got reported afterwards as a change in public mood. And the bill came due in one specific quarter. Parlux's own filing dates it. Sales declined from the quarter ending 31st of December 2008. So Christmas 2008 is when the 2000s ended. And I would put money on nobody in the building noticing at the time. And a counter, if you've ever walked past one and kept walking, is doing the same job. Now, the other thing that happened in those 10 years, which happened quietly in Brussels, and which is why half the bottles in this episode no longer smell the way they did, well, in 2003, the European Union passed the most consequential piece of perfume law of the century, and it didn't ban a single molecule. All it did was require 26 named materials to be printed on the perfume box instead of hiding inside the word parfum. And oak moss was on that list. So were coumarin, citral, linalool, which between them are most of what makes an old perfume smell the way it does. Nothing was forbidden, though. 26 things were simply made visible, which sounds like the smallest thing a regulator has ever done. And a long column of chemical names on a carton reads to a retail buyer, and I've never once heard anybody dispute this, exactly like a warning label. So the big houses quietly adopted a rule that the declarable list should stay short, and then they went back through their own catalogues and shortened it. So an industry rewrote its own history because of a labeling requirement. Not a ban, just the small print. So the next part now gets argued about more than almost anything else in perfume, and most of the argument runs on one wrong word, so I am going to go slowly. Oak moss was never banned. It's restricted. It's legal and perfumers still buy it, and you can smell it in things made this year. What the EU actually prohibited under a regulation adopted in 2017 and applying from 2019 was two molecules found inside it. Meanwhile, Lyrol, a synthetic, the lily of the valley note propping up 1090s florals, was banned outright, and not one candle was lit for it. Whatever the pressure of that decade was, it was never an assault on naturals. It went after the things that make skin react, and those live in both columns quite cheerfully. And we keep the other story, the one where regulation martyrs come after some beautiful old natural because, that story has a hero in it. Whereas the true one has a committee. And then the squeeze, nobody joins up, which is the one that explains why the decade sounds the way it does. From March 2009, you could no longer generate new animal safety data in Europe to qualify a new aroma molecule. In the same stretch, registering a molecule at all acquired a fixed floor of cost. The dossier and the base testing package, which is much the same whether you sell 1 ton of the stuff or 9 bottles per kilo, that falls hardest on the small specialist materials, and the odd little things quietly went away. And those two things are the same 18 months. The palette got narrower, and the price of inventing a replacement went up, so the complaint that everything started smelling the same is correct. People put it down to laziness, or to cowardice, or to whatever they were already cross about. Arithmetic. But 2 bottles show you what was actually at stake, and neither of them survived it. Dior Homme by Olivia Polge, 2005. This is an eau de toilette, and the notes are sage, bergamot, lavender, Italian iris, concrete, cacao, cardamom, amber, vetiver, patchouli, leather, and it gives you 20 minutes of cool, medicinal lavender, which isn't representative of anything that follows. And then the iris arrives, and the perfume becomes itself. It is cold and rooty and powdery and buttery and carroty and metallic all at the same time. And people call that phrase makeup, and they are naming a real shed material rather than insulting it, because cacao warms it from hour 2, then 5 hours of dry, sweet suede. It's a mass market masculine that was built on the most expensive thing on the shelf, which is the detail that decided its future. M7 by Alberto Marias and Jacques Cavalier in 2002, also eau de toilette. And here the notes: bergamot, mandarin, rosemary, agar wood, Haitian vetiver, amber, and musk is now discontinued. It was the first mainstream Western oud 6 years early, and it carried agar wood in its published pyramid 6 years before anybody was saying oud, and anyone calling it an oud perfume hasn't smelled it, because what it actually does is cherry cola. It has a zesty bergamot and rosemary for a few seconds, and then it honeys almost immediately, and it softens hard at 20 minutes, and from about 90 minutes onwards, it's medicinal woods and dry amber over something that smells like cough syrup and is, if you can imagine this, wonderful. And every bottle still circulating is between 15 and 24 years old and is aged in a cupboard somebody else owned. So nobody can honestly tell you how it performs now. Travel sprays, refill atomizers, discovery sets, all of it stopped being a promotional afterthought and became a proper tier of the business. And Americans got the restrictions without the transparency. They got the same rewrite on the same line out of the same tank and no obligation to mention it on the box. And I've gone looking for the moment that somebody decided that, and there's no moment. There's a European regulation, an American absence of one, and a manufacturing decision sitting in the gap that never had to be defended because it was never once asked about. And that's how most of this decade worked, and it's the reason it's so difficult to be properly angry about any of it. Now, the thing I didn't know when I started this, and which rearranged the whole episode once I did, well, in October 2004, the Nobel Prize for Medicine went to two Americans, Richard Axel and Linda Buck, for working out how smell happens at all, and their papers from 1991. And basically, here's all of it. What they said is, your nose is not one detector. You carry about 1,000 genes for building smell detectors, and each one is shaped to catch a different kind of molecule. 3% of all of your genes is spent on nothing but this. And rather more than half of those genes no longer work, which we'll come back to. So the number actually in service is closer to 400. Now, a rose sets off one handful of those 1,000, and petrol sets off a different handful. So the brain never receives a smell as such. It receives a list of which detectors went off and which stayed quiet, and it has learned over a lifetime of doing this what each list means. What they did not do is the more interesting half, and it is the half nobody puts in the headline. Axel and Buck found the detectors, and they found how the detectors are wired. But what has never been found then or since is the next bit. Nobody can tell you why a pattern of firing detectors arrives in a head as a rose. Machines have got frighteningly good at guessing what a new molecule will smell like, and I mean, since about 2023, but guessing correctly is not the same as knowing why. And we have the equipment, but we have no idea how the equipment produces roses. But the result that should have changed everything actually arrived in 2007, and almost nobody outside the perfume field has heard of it. A team went through 335 human smell detectors, one at a time, hunting for the one that picks up a molecule called androstenone. You know, androstenone you find in sweat, more of it in men's than in women's, and it's a close cousin to truffles. And both of them are in a very large number of arguments. Well, they found it. And they found it comes in two common versions. And which one you have was settled before you were born. And then they proceeded to test nearly 400 people. And the ones with the second version were less sensitive to the molecule, which you would expect. But they also found it less unpleasant. Not unpleasant out of politeness, but less unpleasant because it wasn't arriving as the same smell, which is a stranger sentence than it looks, because it means that two people can be handed the identical molecule, and only one of them is being handed a problem. And this sits on top of something I still have trouble believing. Of the 1,000-odd smell genes we're all carrying, more than half of them don't work. In other words, they're not broken in humans as a species. They might be broken in you, but working in the person standing next to you, and the other way around on the next gene along. So, one study
took 189 people and checked 51 of those genes, and it found 178 different working sets, which is very nearly one each. The practical version of all of this is a single number. Pick any two people in a room, and at least 14% of their working smell equipment is different equipment. And the next part is the one I can't really get past, and it's not a scientific finding. It's an absence. I went looking for what the perfume industry said when a Nobel Prize was awarded for the mechanism of the exact thing it sells, and I couldn't find anything. Not a statement, not a perfumer on the record, not a fragrance house saying so much as, "Well done." You know, the trade press covered it the way trade press covers things. Adequately. On a Thursday. Meanwhile, across the 10 years that produced all of that science, perfumery introduced no family of smells whatsoever. You know, a few woody ambers, a couple of musks, mostly sequels to the musks that already existed. The most talked about launch of the decade was a molecule from 1973, sold on its own in a bottle. I thought that was rather a good idea at the time, and 20 years of being invited to sneer at it hasn't moved me. But everything the counter did in that decade rested on one assumption. A smell is a fixed object that arrives the same way in every head in the room. That is what a perfume engineered for 10 feet is. It's a machine spraying cologne down a shop corridor. It's the same assumption with a budget attached. And the science of that same decade was quietly establishing that it does not work like that at all. The 14% isn't a difference of opinion or of sensitivity or of how much attention anybody is paying. It's hardware. It was there before either of us walked into a shop, and it will be there afterwards. So the bouncer was standing there broadcasting a code that nobody in the corridor was receiving the same way. They were never selling you a smell. What they were selling, all of them, the whole 10 years, was that the idea was that everyone in the corridor would agree about it. Which brings me back to the shelf and the 7 bottles I have to answer for. So 4 of them I've argued with for 20 years, and 3 of them I've never once explained to anybody, including myself. 2 of them are Hermes, and they're both more or less nothing. So this is Un Jardin sur Lenny. This is by Jean-Claude Eleanor, 2005, and it is an eau de toilette. The notes here are green mango, grapefruit, lotus, calamus, aromatic rushes, bulrush, frankincense, sycamore wood. Eleanor built it up after a trip to the Nile off green fruit he found on a mango grove on an island, and the bottle is tinted green because of it. And the first 20 minutes are a green mango, and the word doing the work is green, not the tropical sweet thing in every fruity floral. This is unripe and sappy and tart and almost faintly turpentine, with grapefruit sitting underneath it and something faintly bitter behind that. And then it goes high and stays high, and a thin, bright green line over a woody floor, and the mango never turns sweet, which is the part that's actually difficult, because fruit wants to go sugary as it warms, and this one refuses. From about 90 minutes, you get the riverbank rather than the fruit. You get reeds and dry incense and a peppery undertone and an arid, dusty quality that ought to be impossible next to all that green, and almost nothing else smells dry and green simultaneously. And after 3 hours, there is a thin sycamore and a transparent musk sitting directly on the skin. And then there is nothing. 3 hours, sometimes less. It's the shortest lived bottle on this tray by a distance, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because it's also the single most common complaint about it And the complaint is correct. I've known about the 3 years for years. I've bought it anyway. Terre de Mez in 2009. And the notes over here are grapefruit, orange, shiso, a flint accord, woods, and the shiso is what separates the parfum from the toilette. And this is my adulting scent. It's when I need to be the most competent person in a room, this is what goes on. And I've worn it that way for years without once asking myself who taught me it meant that. And it opens bright and luminous citrus. And luminous is the word I want because it is lit rather than sharp. It's really understated from the first second. You know, this perfume's never raised its voice in its life. And when the flint arrives, the flint is the whole argument. You know, there's no flint in perfumery. It's not a material. You can't buy it. And Eleanor built the impression of one largely out of things already sitting on the shelf, and then he sold several million bottles out of it. The dry down is the part I can't describe without having to leave the room, so I'm going to take you with me. Yosemite, early, with the dawn only just up, standing at the foot of El Capitan, close enough to put my nose against the rock, and there's a climbing route straight up the middle of that face, and then the route is called the nose, which I'm aware is doing me an enormous favor here, and that's the dry down. It's the mineral edge coming off a rock face at first light, and underneath it the cold, bright green of the valley floor before the days warmed any of it, and it's dense and somehow still sitting right down on the skin instead of filling the room. And it's 8 hours of that, and it never once changes its mind. You know, some people call this a masterpiece, and some people call it a very long corridor. So Terre de Mez gets attacked for being too respectable, and Fierce gets attacked for not being respectable enough. And the actual liquid has almost nothing to do with either verdict. Now we have number 5, A Premiere by Jacques Polge, 2007, and it was reformulated in 2015. And the notes here are aldehydes, May rose, neroli, ylang ylang, jasmine, vanilla, musk, with vetiver and sandalwood in the fuller listings. And the aldehydes are demoted, not removed, and that is the whole design. Jacques Polge takes number 5 and turns the aldehydes down until the soap has gone, and the powder and the animal underneath it have gone, and what's left is the same silhouette with the windows open, lit from behind, agreeing with you about everything. And I have to declare something here because it is about to matter. The bottle here is not the 2007. Chanel reorchestrated a premiere in 2015 in a new bottle, and mine is this one. The 2015 was done by Olivier Polge, Jacques Polge's son. So here is what it does on my skin. And the first thing it does is nothing much. It opens subdued. Number 5 begins with a tingle, an aldehyde fizz that arrives before the perfume does and rather announces itself. And here, there is none of that. And I smell the absence, which is a peculiar sentence, and I'm keeping it because that is what happened. I didn't register the quiet opening. I registered the specific missing thing. The way you register a stair that isn't where your foot expected to be one. And the dry down is markedly less soapy than number 5's because the soap was the aldehydes, and the aldehydes are what went. And it sits on the skin rather than around it. It's very office friendly in the sense that nobody at the next desk is ever going to have an opinion about it. And Angela at Now Smile This wrote the line that decides whether you love it. Instead of the elegant auntie that is number 5, you get her niece, the homecoming queen. So then we have Chance by Jacques Polge, 2002, Eau de Toilette, and the notes here are pink pepper, citron, pineapple, jasmine, orris, hyacinth, patchouli, vetiver, amber, vanilla, white musk. Don't say ethyl maltol. And so Chance was launched the year after Coco Mademoiselle, which tells you what Chanel had decided about the decade. You know, it's the bottle I can't really be smug about because Chanel built Chance for precisely the 15-year-old I told you I was missing from my shelf. And I own one. Mine is the current production, bought long after the fact. So what I'm about to describe is the Toilette as Chanel sells it now. The 2002 is the decant on my left wrist, borrowed for this, and I have the perfume. So here in the or should I say in the current formulation, where on earth am I going to put you? All right, my goodness, maybe over here. What you get is sparkling peppery citrus and a pink pepper doing most of it, and it is brighter than anything else that comes after would lead you to expect. And then you get green hyacinth and a jasmine, and neither of them ever quite sits down because there is hedione underneath, holding the whole thing in the air. And the florals aren't really the point, the lift is. And from our two, clean patchouli and amber, the same washed patchouli as everything else in this episode. 1 year after Coco Mademoiselle proved it worked, and then a soft, musky amber close to the skin, and it's finished. Somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, which is the toilette being a toilette, which is why they've been on my wrists since the beginning. An hour ago, I put a 2002 Chance on one arm and a 2001 Coco Mademoiselle on the other. Neither of them is mine, and I told you I have been assuming for 20 years that there's a distance between them. So let's find out what I've actually been assuming. So Chanel, with Chance, built a perfume to be somebody's first Chanel and never once apologized for doing it. And it worked. Of course it worked. It's probably the best-selling thing I own, and I'd have to check receipts to be sure it isn't the cheapest as well. Nobody's ever written a word about it. Not one. Imagine it's the best-selling one of the best-selling perfumes ever made, and the written record on it's empty. Now, I wouldn't buy this again. And I've said that quite easily, having just spent 2 minutes objecting that nobody ever gave this perfume or that perfume the courtesy of a sentence. I didn't stop reaching for Chance because I read something. There was just nothing to read. I stopped at some point because it stopped being the sort of thing I wore and the decision arrived without a source. So the forgetting isn't only theirs. I've done it to my own bottle in my own house, and I've been calling the result taste ever since. 3 left, and these are the 3 I've never had to defend because nobody's ever asked. So then there is a de Merveille. This is actually by Rolf Schwieger and Natalie Feisthauer. It's a 2004 Eau de Toilette, and let me see where I'm going to put you. Over here, maybe. And the notes are vetiver, oak, cedar, and then an ambergris accord, and pink pepper in the heart, and then bitter orange and lemon. So 7 bottles, 2 houses, and not one of them is the decade. And every one of them was made by the decade. And if you think about it, the loudest decade in the history of perfume the aughts, produced remarkably few bottles you can still buy and smell as they were. And the survivors aren't the ones with the best taste behind them. I would love to tell you they were. They are the ones that were cheap to make and expensive to think of, which is not the same thing and is not nearly as flattering to anybody. If any of this was worth your time, the like and subscribe are the two buttons that keep these episodes coming, so do go and press them. And if you want the longer version, there is a Substack under the same name as all of this, The Perfume Perspective, where I go long on the houses and the history. An episode only has room to gesture at. And I post the bottles that never make the final cut. So subscribe there too. And I'll meet you in your inbox between films.